do you acknowledge that when Democrats black voters vote for Democrats, it's actually because there's a history there. There's a reason that they voted for Democrats in that time period, not because they were just getting welfare money.
Abby, let me be clear. I don't deny that. I think it's also important for the record to be clear that you had the vast majority of Democrats in the Senate were filibustering the 64 Civil Rights Act led by Robert Byrd, who, by the way, was a mentor to Joe Biden when he went into the United States Senate. So if we're going to talk about the history, let's talk about it clearly.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Grab a seat, because this one is a real heavyweight matchup. CNN's Abby Phillip sits down with Congressman Byron Donalds, and what starts as a calm conversation about black families, the Great Society, and American history turns into a full-on tug-of-war over the facts. Byron comes in swinging with his talking points about welfare, marriage rates, and which party really stood with civil rights. And Abby is having absolutely none of it. Every time he reaches for a clean narrative, she pulls the receipts right back out. Stick around all the way through, because the back half is where this thing completely turns, and you do not want to miss how it lands. And while you are here, do me a favor, drop a comment and let me know what city or country you are watching from. I love seeing how far this channel reaches. All right, enough from me. Let's get into it.
Well, first of all, let me just to set the table here. By pretty much every available measure, black families, black individuals in this country are better off today than they were during Jim Crow. Would you agree with that?
Abby, of course I would. I'm not making that point, and this is the problem. What the Democrats, what Hakeem Jeffries did on the House floor, what Jamie Harrison, what the president of the NAACP, what the Biden campaign, because they're the ones who started this, it was really the Biden campaigns who were trying to cherry pick everything. They're trying to twist my words into saying something. I never said that. What I was talking about was specifically black families. And the point that black families being together is a great thing for the black community. And you do have to acknowledge the empirical fact that before Lyndon Johnson's policies and the welfare state that was created in the United States, I'm not talking about good, bad, or indifferent.
But what about
black families were, black marriage rates were significantly higher.
Well, what about
They're
other
rising
things that
again
might
in
have,
America.
But,
that's a good
but
thing.
What
We should
about other
celebrate
things that may have contributed to the, maybe the decline in marriage rates, which, by the way, is not unique to black families. That's happening actually across racial groups. But what about other things? I mean, what about redlining? Do you think that that had an effect on the black family? What about mass incarceration? What about the war on drugs, which was pushed by a Republican president whose advisor said it was specifically to target black people? What about all of those things?
Look, if you want to talk about redlining and a lot of the other policies that were put forward, quite frankly, by the Democrat Party, if you're going to go back to Jim Crow, because Jim Crow was Democrat policies.
Well,
that's what that was.
I know that you know this.
Don't cut me off when I'm trying to make a point.
Let me just,
Abby.
I have to correct a factual point here. I know that you know that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party of today are ideologically not what they were during Jim Crow. You know that, Congressman. So to suggest that, the Democrats of 1920 are the same ideologically as the Democrats of today is inaccurate. So just, you can continue, but I wanted to...
That's not totally true, Abby, and I think if we want to have that conversation about the policy positions between Republicans and Democrats, we can have that conversation, but
one of the other
Abby,
things,
do you want to have a conversation?
One of the other things,
I'm trying to understand how you want this
brought it
to
up,
go.
because since you brought it up on the conservative thing, the other thing that you said was black people voted more conservatively. Were you talking about them voting for Republicans?
In part, yeah, because that's just an empirical fact. That's what we know. That did happen. And the only corollary that I am making is that when families are together and now you're trying to find a way for you to build wealth within your family unit, you're thinking about public policy in a myriad of ways. Because at the end of the day, you want your children to be able to stand on your shoulders. I was very, very fortunate. My mother was able to build a platform for me to be able to stand on and to be able to achieve. Same for my sisters. I'm a very blessed individual because of that. My only point is that when you have a family unit, husband and wife living together, striving together, grinding together, raising children together, you start thinking about public policy in a myriad of ways. And my belief is that dynamic allows people to start thinking about public policy in a much more conservative way as opposed to a much more progressive way. That's my point.
You have to understand what Byron is really doing here, because it is slick. Abby sets the table fairly. She hands him the easy agreement that black families are better off now than they were during Jim Crow, and instead of taking the win, he immediately starts dodging. That tells you everything. When a person gets handed common ground and still squirms, it is because the common ground was never the point. And here is the part that blows my mind. Byron said this: "They are trying to twist my words into saying something. I never said that." But nobody twisted anything. He is the one who keeps reaching back to the era before the Great Society to talk about marriage rates, and then acts shocked when people connect the dots he drew himself. You cannot keep pointing at a time period and then get offended when someone asks what else was happening in that same time period. Because Abby does exactly that, and it is brilliant. She brings up redlining. She brings up mass incarceration. Abby said this: "The war on drugs," whose advisor said it was specifically to target black people. That is the context Byron wants to skip right past, and you can hear why. His whole story falls apart the second you add the other policies that were crushing black communities at the very same time. And then comes the line he treats like a checkmate. Byron said this: "Jim Crow was Democrat policies. That is what that was." He drops it like it ends the argument. It does not. It is a magic trick that only works if you know nothing about how the two parties actually changed. So hold that thought, because Abby is about to take the whole thing apart.
Might be, I mean, I think you're a Republican, so you're entitled to that opinion. But I think what people are taking issue with is you made a couple of statements of fact. And one of the things I was asking you about whether you were talking about black people voting for Republicans. In the time period that you're talking about, the LBJ time period, they started voting for Democrats. And the reason is because of civil rights, because a Democratic president was passing bills that gave them rights. The Voting Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act of 1965, the Housing Fairness Act. So do you acknowledge that when Democrats black voters vote for Democrats, it's actually because there's a history there. There's a reason that they voted for Democrats in that time period, not because they were just getting welfare money.
Abby, let me be clear. I don't deny that. I think it's also important for the record to be clear that you had the vast majority of Democrats in the Senate were filibustering the 64 Civil Rights Act led by Robert Byrd, who, by the way, was a mentor to Joe Biden when he went into the United States Senate. So if we're going to talk about the history, let's talk about it clearly and completely. Republicans have been the ones who were pushing not just the 64 Civil Rights Act, but the other 4 Civil Rights Acts that occurred before 1964. That's the history of the country.
I'm
not denying
there
that.
Were Southern Democrats
Abby,
who
can I finish my point? All I'm asking is to finish my point.
On the facts here, there were Southern Democrats who opposed these civil rights bills. But
yes, that's
a majority
correct.
of them voted for it. It was also led by a Democratic president. So you acknowledge that Southern Democrats were recruited into the Republican Party in the time period after that. So when you talk about this, you just have to acknowledge that there's been a switch happening in the two parties. It's not the same today as it was during Jim Crow. And so when you say that black people voted conservatively, that actually doesn't really tell us anything. It just tells us that they voted for the Republican Party, which is a different thing than it is for today.
Are we also going to acknowledge that how the 64 Civil Rights Act actually got through the U.S. Senate was because of also the leadership of Senator Everett Dirksen, who was the minority Republican leader in the United States Senate at that time.
Absolutely.
You have to acknowledge that. So I think if we're going to talk about this, we have to acknowledge all of the history that went along with it.
I wasn't suggesting
and I think that's a good thing. We should have that historical conversation.
I wasn't suggesting that congressional Republicans necessarily were the stumbling block for any of this legislation. All I'm saying is that when you ask, why do black people vote for Democrats, you have to acknowledge that that is one of the main reasons.
This is the part people need to hear, because Byron tries to rewrite history in real time, and Abby simply refuses to let him. He plays the Robert Byrd card. Byron said this: "The vast majority of Democrats in the Senate were filibustering the 64th Civil Rights Act, led by Robert Byrd. And technically, yes, that happened. But using one true fact to sell a false story is its own kind of dishonesty. Here is what most people do not realize, and this is the history that actually matters. The fight over civil rights was never really left versus right by party name. It was the segregationist South against everyone else. The senators filibustering that bill were Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats, and in the years after the Civil Rights Act passed, that entire bloc walked out of one party and into the other. A Republican, Everett Dirksen, the minority leader at the time, is a huge reason the bill survived the filibuster at all. The labels flipped, the coalitions traded places. That is documented, and Abby lands it perfectly. Abby said this: Southern Democrats were recruited into the Republican Party. In the time period after that, there has been a switch happening in the two parties. That one sentence collapses Byron's entire pitch, because his whole argument depends on pretending the party of a century ago and the party of today are the same thing. They are not. Anyone who has studied this knows they are not. And the reason this matters so much is what Abby says right after. Abby said this: that is one of the main reasons. Black voters did not switch sides for a handout. They moved toward the side that was actively expanding their rights. That is not dependency. That is a community with a long memory rewarding the people who finally opened the door.
I want to just ask one other thing, though, Congressman. It's striking to me that this conversation about the family, about who is the recipient of government benefits, about who was affected by Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society, why is it that that conversation only happens to Black people? When white people are on welfare, when white people are recipients of these programs too, when white people have broken families as well, why is this a message that is always directed at Black Americans?
I didn't say that at all. I think that's what you're insinuating. But let me.
I mean, that's what you did. You were trying to recruit Black voters
Abby,
for
if you're
President Trump.
am I allowed to answer the question? Let me step into that. Okay, a couple of things. Yes, Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, if you look at the empirical data, was destructive in part, and I said even in my comments yesterday in Philadelphia, in part to Black families throughout the United States of America. You also had some of the very damaging policies around the criminal justice system. The 94 crime bill, which was authored by Joe Biden and brought by Joe Biden. Yes, you had the war on drugs that was also very damaging to Black communities. All those things have contributed to that. And where we are today in America is trying to have the economic policies and the public policies so that all people can thrive. And if you're actually going to compare economic policies and public policies between the 45th president and the 46th president, it's without question they were better under the 45th.
Well, look, I mean,
so if you're going to examine today,
the
hold on,
Black
but Abby, if you're going to examine today in America and
Again,
where
I'm gonna
we're
interrupt
going
you
as
on the-
Americans,
I'm gonna
then
interrupt
you
you
have
on
to
the
have the
facts,
right set of economic
Congressman.
policies and the right set of public
Black
policies.
unemployment
I mean,
rate
Abby,
was
you've been
the
interrupting me
lowest
the
in
entire interview.
American-
I'm just trying to have a conversation.
I'm going to interrupt you on the facts, Congressman. The Black unemployment
Sure,
rate was
go
the
ahead.
lowest in American history under Joe Biden just last year. The poverty rate for Black people is the lowest under Joe Biden. So you cannot say empirically for Black people that from a financial level, things were better under Trump. There are other ways that you can make this case, but you cannot say that.
And here's the question that should have ended the whole conversation. Abby asks why this lecture about family and welfare and the Great Society only ever gets aimed at one group. Abby said this: why is this a message that is always directed at Black Americans? Sit with that. White families receive these same programs. White families go through these same struggles. So why does the sermon about dependency only show up the moment the cameras turn toward Black voters? Byron does not have an answer, and you can hear it land. He retreats to the word insinuating, which is what people reach for when the honest answer is uncomfortable. Then he doubles down on the Great Society. Byron said this: the Great Society was destructive in part to Black families. And look, I will give him this much. Programs can have real flaws. That is a fair, grown-up conversation to have. But notice, he only ever tallies the costs on one side of the ledger. He never mentions that those very same decades pried open doors that had been bolted shut for 100 years. You cannot hand someone half the story and stamp the word fact on it. But the moment it all comes crashing down is the economy, because this is where the receipts actually exist. Byron tries to claim the 45th president's record was just plain better, no question about it, and Abby does not flinch for a second. Abby said this: "The black unemployment rate was the lowest in American history. The poverty rate for black people is the lowest. You cannot say things were better." That is how you close an interview. Not with a feeling, with a number that anybody at home can go check. And looking back at this now, what stands out is how little the playbook has changed. You take a struggle that is genuinely real, like prices and affordability, and you quietly bolt it onto a much bigger story about who deserves the blame. Abby's entire job in this clip was to keep snapping the conversation back to what is actually true, over and over, while being talked over the whole time. She stayed calm, she stayed factual, and she won every exchange that mattered. That is what winning a debate really looks like. It is never who talks the loudest. It is who is still standing once you check the facts. So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments, please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.